Okay, so this is the second conversation in the Aston Conversation series, and I'm very pleased today to have Steve Lawson, whom I've only met a couple of times, but it has been indicated to me by several people that I should have further conversations with him. So here is an opportunity to have another conversation.
Absolutely.
Steve is a bass player, bass guitar player, and a musician, and really a man of many different talents from what he tells me. I mean, he was just explaining to me how he's got a potential career in transport optimization, but let's not go into that. So today I want to talk really a little bit about the relationship between art and technology, and what a lot of people kind of say, oh, Steve is so good at is your ability to use modern technology, social media, Twitter, Facebook, and the whole panoply of associated things to good effect, so as to actually enable you to have a career as a musician, but outside the normal conventional industries that we know about. And that's great, and it's very interesting. But what I like to talk more about is about the relationship between these technologies and the act of creation. What does it mean to be an artist, a musician, in a world where you're interacting with people who may be here today at a gig that you have in Birmingham, or I mean, you're well known for your house concerts as well in people's houses, or maybe on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
And they never meet you face to face. How does that affect your process? Does it have any effect? I mean, you are old enough to remember a different world.
But I'm old enough to remember a world in which what I do wouldn't work. So I think there are a number of sort of headline figures that sort of or sort of things that would be pull quotes if this was an article. And one of them is that what I do just wouldn't have functioned without the internet at all. I couldn't have explored what I do in the way that I do. This is one of the things that I found recently when I was looking at, because I bundled my back catalogue together, and there were two ways in which I kind of sell it as a kind of collection. And one is on a USB stick. So on a USB stick, I've got one in my bags, which has 27 albums on it and a live video on my novel. And the other is that I do a subscription service where if you subscribe to me for 20 quid a year, you get my 10 completely solo records and the next year's worth of output. And what was odd was when I was looking at that is that there are very few artists who are as unknown as I am that have that kind of volume of work, certainly of my age. And the reason is that the old industry had no affordance within it for continued creative success and commercial failure. So you couldn't. So what are the numbers of sales and my audience figures are easily sufficient for me to do what I do. But if I was having to press vinyl and have a record label that did it for me and distribute to shops and all those ancillary costs and the marketing budget, I would be an abject failure. And so for them, so at that point, what I would have done is I probably would have made one record, and I would have lost a truckload of money on it, and they would have turned around and gone, okay, now you need to do something different. So I might have had a career, but I would not have had a career doing what I'm doing because the market forces on that would have exerted themselves in such a way that because I was in debt to the label, I was indentured to them as well, and so that they would then start to dictate to some degree the kind of record that I could make.
So in a sense, you're saying the technology has lowered the barrier,
Well,
the entry barrier, but what I'm interpreting here is also the survival barrier, in a certain sense, the fact that you could carry on working as a musician without, in the old model, either you succeeded, and if you didn't, you were out.
It's tipped the scales. So I think the idea of binary scales in this are kind of sort of slightly clumsy, but we'll use it for now. But the idea that on one side you have commercial interest, and on the other side you have artistic curiosity. And it used to be that was completely subservient to this, that all the weight was on commercial viability because you were trying to make things that you had to sell. And the production cost, and the cost of going in a studio and recording, and actually recording to any kind of high level, was so high that became the beast that needed to be fed. And so the creative considerations were subservient to that. So within that, an awful lot of great music happened. It's not, there isn't this kind of split where suddenly recording got cheaper and loads of great music happened. The majority of music has always been terrible. but there's always been enough in that tiny percentage. The anomalies have always been remarkable, and there was enough creative space within that people could do weird things, and there have been certain times when there was a confluence of culture and experimentation, and the media have been caught napping and not labelled a thing to the point where it kills it, so that for a while, so with progressive rock, there was a level of experimentation, but that was all funded by public school. All the people making progressive records were incredibly rich already, and the same happened with fusion, the explosion of electric jazz that happened after Miles Davis. That it was an incredibly fertile creative time, commercially successful because it was marketed well, but it was killed as soon as people started trying to label it, and it ceased to be interesting when, because of philosophical changes in the way that we function as human beings, that going from the 70s into the 80s, and all the technological changes that happened with that, and that there was that bubble of time, and so one of the problems is that with the way that people describe those transitions is that they ignore the cultural context, and they just look at headline figures about money and go, well, look, musicians aren't making any money anymore. You go, yeah, but musicians aren't losing money like they were back then, because what you're looking at is the winners, and history is always written by the winners, and the history of the music industry is written not only by winners, it's written by lottery winners. It's written by a handful of people
very few.
A tiny, minuscule number of people who made out like bandits, and it's a very model of destructive capitalism, in that it generated gross earnings on a level that everybody went, wow, what a success. But it also kept everybody on the hook to the degree so everybody had these records that they'd made that were never recouped in their deal, but they were all promised that at some point they would land a track on a film score and that would pay off all their debts, or the single would be released, or someone else would cover it. So they weren't going to step outside of that and go, I've been screwed, this record label has destroyed me, because they were beholden to the record label and the publisher for that possible future earnings, or for the potential to make future records, because often they were bound into multi-album deals.
Didn't this just make people abandon music as a result of the difficulty?
No, it didn't, because I think there was just the sense that it was, I think because rock and roll was such, the mythology of it was so compelling to emotionally stunted adolescent men particularly. It was such a compelling narrative, and it was so aggressively and expensively marketed as the dominant kind of cultural meme of its time. It became the container for teenage dreams, that the idea that being a teenager was invented in the 50s, and its vehicle was music, that they chose music over and above all the other art forms.
So you're not suggesting that in the past it was more difficult to become a musician and now it's easier to be a musician?
I think it's always been easy to be a musician. I think the visibility is much easier now. Production to a quote unquote professional standard is this is the transformative change. And so one of the things that I always try and do when I'm looking at what's happened, the kind of this historical timeline, is try and discern which of the transformations in what's gone on are incremental and which ones are transformative. So which ones are more or less of a thing that already existed, and which ones are totally new happening. And what's happened in recording technology is a totally new happening, because if you think about the evolution of recording and what happened with it initially, I had this conversation with my students at Kidderminster recently, because we were talking about Walter Benjamin, and when he was writing in 1935 about this terrible thing where art is destroyed by being manufactured, he was talking about really low quality recordings, so a very poor black and white photocopy of what music was meant to be, and you had one mic in a room, and the musicians would have been spaced out in a ridiculous way. Drummer would be miles away, double bass player would be right close to the mic, because it was recorded on a single mic, which meant that as that developed and as the quest for fidelity improved, the quality of individual microphones became sacrosanct, and studios became sacred space. That the idea that the room was the most important place, that was the first bit of recording mythology. And so the preeminence of the recording studio as the kind of the temple within which this spiritual occurrence happened and people made records, that started with the idea, with the need for a room where you could space musicians out and the ones at the back wouldn't sound like they were a mile away. So acoustics developed through that. Then when we developed multi-track recording, before automation and before these things could all be digitized, the mixing of those multiple tracks into a single kind of playable stereo file was itself a performance. And so the performative nature of a mixing desk, it wasn't just about fidelity, it suddenly became about malleability.
Because it became quite a creative process,
Yeah.
that step, so to speak.
And so by this time, the temple status of studios was established. That wasn't about to be unpacked at that point, and particularly because the labels owned the studios a lot of the time, they didn't want to undo that because they wanted to control that. So now they suddenly had this thing where both the fidelity and the performative nature of the recording technology became this really special thing. So you had a room with really expensive equipment in it, artificially expensive equipment in it, that was then, so that the music was recorded and then the mix was performed by an engineer. So you had expertise, equipment and space, all of which was controlled and inflated in price beyond anything useful at all. So producers in particular, engineers at the top end, but were paid absurd amounts of money to make records. It wasn't a job, it was a lottery win. And the process of making records stayed in that place for a very long time, and it wasn't until the influence of punk. I don't think the first generation of punk worked like this because the first Pistols record is actually a very expensive sounding record. But American punk, and in the UK, I think people like Betty Bragg kind of took nascent 4-track home recording stuff and went, actually we can make music that has an aesthetic that we like, a desirable aesthetic with this equipment. And all that was far more radical than any of the politics of McLaren and Westwood. That the DIY, the invention of an aesthetic that said actually sounding like crap is a good thing. Not because we stayed there, but because it gave us a position from which to say, how good can we get in this position? How interesting can we make art now that we've taken away the need for the temple, that mediation in spiritual terms?
That's actually quite early. I mean, that's 1980s.
Yeah. So yes, absolutely. So most of these transitions happened before that, and so there were records that were made, particularly towards the end of the 80s, that are basically home recordings that are undiscernible from things that were made in studios. And I have a friend, but into the 90s, you started getting massive global smash hit records that were made in that way. My favourite example is a track called Your Woman by an artist called Whitetown, which was a sample of an Al Bowley record from 1915, with him singing over the top. And the whole lot, it was on an Atari ST, which even by then was 10-year-old technology, and a sampler and a mic, and the whole lot cost him about 400 quid, and it was bootleg software. He hadn't paid for any software. And he made a record that became a #1 hit all over the globe. And that was a great story for musicians, and nobody else knew about it. Everybody else just saw him as a pop star, and he was just a bloke from Derby who made this amazing record. And that was revolutionary. But what happened off the back of that was that just kept getting better and better and better. And so what we lost was the sound of these amazing rooms. And so there was still the option for big bands to go into amazing spaces and record them and use that as a kind of, sort of, we're still really rich and we're still really special. And a lot was made of that. And so the recent conversation around Dave Grohl from the Foo Fighters going on about how terrible digital music is and how everything should be analog. It's it's a clumsy version of that. He's going on about how I have the money to buy all this equipment or rent it or borrow it, and that needs to be recognised as special because I've spent all this money on it. You could make an undiscernibly equally fantastic sounding record with stuff in a Mac laptop. So
that's the story in the last 10, 15
exactly.
years. There's been people doing that on their laptops.
So what this has done, so back to our scales between economics and curiosity, in fact even more than creativity, that I was able to experiment at the beginning of my career, that the recordings that went into my first album weren't made for a record. It was me documenting my gigs with a stereo mic in front of my amp at a couple of gigs that I lied to be able to get. There wasn't a plan. I didn't go, I need to become a solo artist, I need to get signed, I need a marketer and a manager. It was just curiosity. So there was no economic impetus to it at all. I wasn't really thinking about getting paid for the gigs. I did because...
Do you think that that's common among musicians?
I think that anyone sensible starts out thinking it should be a job. I think
you said to me another time that people have to give up the idea that by becoming musicians they're going to become make millions.
I think that becoming a thing that people actually aim towards is a creation of music education. That the increasing sort of clumsily vocational nature of our educational institutions have tried to turn music into a career that can be packaged and sold like that. And the inevitable consequence of that is tribute bands. Because you can make, if you can do a passable version of songs by the Police aren't going to step in and replace that for you, certainly not at club level. So there's a place for you to go and play. You take all of the curiosity out of it, and it becomes a business decision. And you go, great, people want to hear the Police's songs. I look a bit like Sting, and I can play, and I can go and do that. And colleges are great for churning people out to do that. They can train them in that skill set. But if you've got into a vocational mindset and you're saying this needs to be a job, then what I do is total anathema to that, because there's no path in what I do that you can follow.
But I think that's been true in many of the different arts. I mean, if you think about it, there has always been writers who've written because they had to write, and others who've written because they were journalists or some other form where they learned to write in order just to bring enough food on the table.
But I also think that
sometimes you had people who were doing that and happened to be extremely talented. I mean, Charles Dickens or something.
But there was also other than the occasional kind of model or TV presenter who published a memoir, you didn't really have completely talentless people becoming writers in that way. And when you did it, they were normally famous elsewhere.
Okay. Yeah.
And you did it. It was always been that in music. That because music has always been marketed about things other than music, that the number of people who buy music because of the music is depressingly small.
Do they buy music for what reason?
There's a whole self-branding thing to it. There's a sense of belonging. There's the way that things are marketed. That we're told what's good and what's bad. I mean, there is that in writing. That I don't think many people think that 50 Shades of Grey is a fantastic literary work. And part of it was marketing. Part of it was about breaking taboos. Part of it was just a confluence of a whole load of internet things that came out at the right time. 50
Shades of Grey is claimed to have been one of the motivating reasons for the growth of the use of e-readers, Kindles particularly.
Because we would hide it.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Whereas someone like, the writing world is chock full of people who are skilled writers who apply it to the popular form. So someone like J.K. Rowling, I think, is actually when she chooses to be quite an amazing wordsmith. That she does that very, very well, and she doesn't write highbrow stuff because she's not interested in doing that at this point. Maybe she does under a number of pseudonyms, having done it once. There might be a load of writers that are her. But she's not. There isn't really the kind of literary equivalent of a garage band becoming massive.
Right. Okay.
But because music was always about branding in that way, and I think books have tried to copy that, and I think there was a time in the late 90s when all of a sudden the headline on over any newly signed author to a publishing contract was that they got signed for £1 million. £1 million became this mythological amount. It was like Zadie Smith got £1 million advance for her book and whatever, and it was like, well, yeah, but that doesn't mean it's any good. It just means they think they can sell it.
And it became, in that sense, very similar to the signing of bands. And
absolutely, and that was always the thing. Was that bands
publishers usually lost money on that one.
Absolutely, and it was. And again, the spread bet of a publisher is exactly the same as it is for a record label. They only need one to pay all their bills, and they might own a whole load of back catalogue that they can do that with. And with literature, because old writing is much easier to reproduce than old recording, and there aren't even recordings of to actually. If you want to put out a new version of Beethoven symphonies, that's a lot of time in the studio with an orchestra. It costs a lot of money. If you want to reissue Dickens, that's not an expensive thing to do, and it's all public domain, and it doesn't cost you anything to do. So by repackaging the classics and selling a handful of each of them, publishers can spread their earnings across a massive number of titles, and if they own the means to print books at low cost, they can do that in a way that new authors can't really compete with until digitization.
Okay.
And so this again is where those scales are tipped, and this was the next transformative thing in both in writing and music, and to an extent, graphic and sort of visual art. But I think we'll get onto that as a separate thing. But writing and music is interesting like this because it used to be that its material nature was defined its economics, that it was a scarcity-based economics. I have 10 books, you want one of them, You pay me for it, now I have 9, so my potential for earning is lower, but I actually have cash in that. That very simple transactional economics based on scarcity. And as soon as you can...
And that also applied with vinyl records.
Absolutely, yeah. So vinyl, tape, CD, whatever format, even sheet music, you had to print it in order for people to get it. And the point at which that you could effectively reproduce a digital item infinitely at full quality to an infinite number of copies, or effectively infinite number of copies at zero marginal cost, because there is a cost, but it's absorbed in what people are already paying for their bandwidth. That at that point the economics move from scarcity to ubiquity. So the economics of ubiquity, the economics of you having a thing of mine, and now not only do I have the money you've given me for it, but more of that stuff exists. But then when you start looking at what that existence is, you go, well, it's not a thing. That a digital file isn't a thing; it doesn't exist. That in Schrödinger terms, it might be dead, it might not, and until you attempt to experience it. It's the potential for an experience, and it requires a certain kind of software and operating system and speakers and all of that kind of stuff in a way that whereas a vinyl record has within it, that it's a physical object that does one thing, and I suppose you can scratch a record. There is a sort of ontological parallel there, I guess.
Well, you can also tear up a book, or damage a painting. That's not. But there is a tangibility.
Yes.
It's manifest. Yeah. You can pick it up.
And a file isn't, and so a file can sit on a hard drive somewhere, and that's one iteration of the file. And this is where the lawsuits in America around BitTorrent got ridiculous, was that they would sue someone based on the number of people who downloaded a thing. And you go, really? That you actually recognise that as a thing, that as being 150 iterations of that thing, and so suddenly economics continued to be iterative. So that each of those experiences had some kind of value, and there was some limitation on them, and they were measurable. But the limitation was actually about attention and interest. It wasn't about access, or it shouldn't be. And so the weird thing about what Apple did, and Apple, when we been talked about as being either the saviors or the main player or whatever in the music industry, the weird thing was that what they did was they continued this conversation about digitized music, as though. Did you just pause there? So what Apple did was that they continued the language of stuff around a thing that was no longer stuff. Right. So you still bought albums and singles, and people and they even
it's been turned into a metaphor.
Yeah.
But they extended from
and they even started to apply value criteria to the length of individual tracks, which is so odd that if it was over 10 minutes, you couldn't buy it as a single track, because something that was 9 minutes was worth less than something that was 11 minutes long, which is absolutely nuts, completely absurd that would be that would be a measurement of anything. So they're
clearly a metric system. If it's point at 10, multiples 10. Of 10.
I think it was 10, and the pricing model. There's this idea that if I sold a CD in a shop, my return on that is a couple of quid at most, even if I own the master. That the cost of me getting the distributor and it getting there and them taking their cut and me manufacturing the disc in the first place, and especially if I'm paying for artwork, if I'm not doing that myself, there's a very small return on it for me. And then I need to actually go through the accounting process of collecting that money, because I don't get paid up front.
But I mean,
so they were selling CDs in shops for decreasing amounts of money. So it's now well under a tenner now to buy a CD in HMV, and yet iTunes were trying to charge the same amount for the digital version, because they were trying to game it so that people felt that digital stuff was the same as physical stuff, just without the physical stuff getting in the way, which was absurd and held us back very hugely in the conversation about what all this stuff means.
Do you think that's been overcome yet?
Well, I think that it's broadened out, and I think that it's become. Even this is the odd thing, is that the people who've probably done the best job of getting us past that is Spotify.
Right.
And yet they've done it in a really ridiculous way. They've done it in a horrible way, because they've done it.
You pay a subscription every month and then get everything.
And they still what they're trying to do. So Apple took the language of CDs and albums and started talking about digital that way. What Spotify have done is they've taken the language of the old industry, which was all about headline gross figures, and tried to make that the thing. So we're giving 70% of our earnings back to back to the paid back to rights holders is their euphemism for record labels that keep all the money, and publishers. And so they obfuscate all of their figures by instead of acknowledging that there is still an iterative economics around this, that each time someone listens to a thing, there's a transaction that's taking place between me and them in terms of their attention, and that is expressible financially. Like that I can, if I can measure the number of those attention transactions that have taken place, the number of times that people have given me their attention for a certain amount of time.
Well, that's possible on Spotify.
Absolutely.
It's not possible in general on the internet or in the digital world.
No, but it would be possible online if there was actually any sort of joined up some metrics between the different platforms where people do that. Because iTunes probably have that data.
Oh yes, they have that data on downloads, but not on.
But they probably do on listening as well. The Last.fm was the platform that was collecting that. I mean, it's a very specific demographic that use Last.fm. But there is data there that can be
still going.
Yeah, I still use it for sort of personal data collection. But there are stats there, and I still use it as a measure of things that are popular amongst my listeners. It's become a large enough data set that I can actually, it's meaningful. So what Spotify have done is they've basically colonized the conversation around streaming, so that we think of streaming as being a thing where you pay a set amount of money and you get access to all music, rather than streaming actually being a technological discussion about not hosting the file on your own hard drive. That's all it means. Because actually a lot of what goes on with Spotify, it's downloaded into the app anyway.
Mm.
So the minute your app starts buffering, it ceases to be a streaming service.
Yes.
So
well, I mean, technically, it has to be downloaded in order to play.
Yeah.
The fact that it then deletes it immediately, continuously.
But it doesn't. That's the thing. If you've got a Spotify subscription, then you can download playlists and keep them and play them offline. You go, well, then that's not a streaming service anymore, and that's okay. But that doesn't really change what Spotify is. The point in which it does change it is when that becomes so simple to do that there's no purpose or no perceived purpose in going and buying a thing, that actually paying any sort of unit cost to an artist, whether that's for access to their particular work or an album-based kind of sum of money.
But there has been supposedly there is this thing of, the music industry has to change its business model. Now people have to make money out of gigs and other merchandise and things like that, and that there is no real future in getting money out of the digital manifestation of their music. That's one perspective.
And I think there are two massive problems with that. One of which is that it assumes, it basically pushes us back into an age when there is a cycle of behaviours that has to go on around the economics of music, which is what we tried to leave behind. That's what used to be, that you made a record every 2 years, you recouped that money on tour, you sold T-shirts in order to make the tour break even. The tour was advertising for the record, and the record was advertising for the tour, and somewhere in the middle, everybody made money except the artists, and that's what we got away from. So to now go back to a place where we go, where we say, well, you have to make records in order to promote a tour. You go, yeah, but what about artists who don't want to tour? What about kinds of music that can't be manifest like that? What about music that only works as an installation? What about things that aren't pop music? Why do we have this horrific band model of what's going on with music? And so it's funny that one of the accusations I get thrown at me when I start talking about what I do as a success is people go, well, it's all right for you. And I go, yes, at last it's all right for me, because it was never all right for me before. And that being a solo artist doing what I did...
Why is that? I mean, what are they trying to say?
What they're trying to say is normally, you're a solo artist, you can do this. You're a solo artist who doesn't require microphones to record. You can. I go, great, that's fantastic. And then it's not that there aren't other kinds of music I could do. I chose to do what I do because it fits. So it's curiosity, but there's also a pragmatism in there. I'd love to write for orchestra. I'd love to do a concerto for electric bass and orchestra. There was nothing within my world that is going to make that possible. And that if I obsessed over that and spent the next 10 years writing it, trying to fund it, I might be able to get it done at some point. But in the process, I'd lose out on 10 years of musical practice because of an obsession over the idea that became a fetish. And I think a lot of music projects do take on the role of fetish in the life of the artist. And so and because they're unwilling to say, Why don't we do a smaller project? Because smaller projects fit the web. But the old model in the 80s, giantism was the thing, and you had to play bigger and bigger venues to show how successful you were and important you were. That's not the case anymore. That if you're the kind of band that can't play in a living room or play in a studio and just stream live to the web, then you're going to suffer, and that's okay.
So what you're saying, though, is that both pre-web and post-web, the technologies were determining very specifically the type and range of music that works best. So pre-web, it was this tendency to studios, the tendency to go bigger and bigger. Post-web, the technology would seem to support the smaller end of the scale.
I don't think it's quite as determinist as that. I think that because of cultural dispensation, there was technology had consciously built in affordances for certain kinds of creative practice. And so, because of the studio, the manifestation of the studio and the aura around studio. So going back to Benjamin and his whole thing about the loss of aura, that one of the ways of re-enchanting music was to make the process of making music and doing recordings itself a hallowed process. And so,
where are we then now?
Well, this is the big question. And so this is sort of almost like where we should get to in about 20 minutes' time. Is how do we re-enchant the experience of music at a time when what's being celebrated is either nostalgic mythologizing of days gone by in the format of The Voice or X Factor or whatever. It feels like a very 1980s thing, that this idea that being rags to riches stories are somehow really important and doing cover versions is somehow a really amazing, emotive thing, and people don't realise they're being played at quite the degree that they are. And I'm kind of okay with it.
But for me, it's a huge problem, a huge social problem, because if you talk to most young people in school today, and you ask them what their ambitions are, a huge proportion of them will say to become successful on X Factor or something similar, rather than a whole range of other socially useful careers, from being a doctor to an engineer to something else.
And there are all kinds of reasons for that, and that as a.
I mean, this wasn't always the case. It wasn't in the 50s that people
wanted
to win.
But I think that I mean, there were a number of things that have fed into that. One of which was the emergence of the National Lottery as a thing. That I know people who were working as in social fields in schools around the time the lottery came out, and there was this very conscious shift from I'm going to become a fireman to I'm going to win the lottery. In terms of very, very young kids, 5, 6, 7-year-olds, who instead of saying I'm going to become a fireman or a policeman or a shepherd or whatever other kind of archaic notion they had of what was the idealised job, they were actually going, I'm going to win the lottery. Why? Because I saw people on telly and they're really happy. And that got replaced by TV. The idea of reality TV is such an odd emergence, because it's like, well, why didn't it exist before? Did it? How did it get a name? But this sort of high school competition on telly where we celebrate being marginally above mediocre, but we do it via the mechanism of nostalgia, that it's all about selling people their childhood back and making us feel slightly less like we're about to die. And that's kind of weird. There's a quest for normalcy, but there are a number of reasons why music has worked like that, and part of it is about the need for the major record labels to continue to colonise the national conversation about music as a popular cultural force.
Well, they've certainly had to try to control that, because so much money for them has ridden on their ability to control that conversation.
Absolutely, so there are a couple of things that have happened. So let's use as an example the whole notion of the pop charts and its declining significance. And the reason for that is that the top 40, that number 40 is the top half of a fraction. And in the 80s, it was a fraction. The bottom half was the number of singles that were available to buy at any one time. So the top 40 singles, and the main place where people would buy them was either Our Price or Woolworths. I mean, there were big mega stores as well, but the vast majority of their sales were Our Price and Woolworths. And in Our Price, at any one time, they stocked probably about 130 singles. So the top 40 was 40 out of 130. And getting into that 130 was a very expensive business. It was one that was controlled by a number of cartels to do with distribution and publicity and radio and TV access and all that. But it meant that 40 was both likely to be broadly representative of what the country was interested in, would have a number of really weird anomalies in it, because when you went in to go shopping, there's 130 things. If you like heavy metal, you're going to buy the Iron Maiden single that's out because it's the only one that's going to be there. So you would get this sort of enforced clustering around stylistic archetypes. So you would end up with really odd records, charity records and novelty records, and the occasional kind of instrumental jazz hit or whatever, just crazy things that would happen because of that limited access. Now, there's no such thing as back catalogue. So that any one time you can get onto iTunes and buy upwards of 15 million different tracks, all of which can chart if they're bought in a significant enough number. There's no distinction drawn. So when Don't Stop Believing by Journey was used on Glee in a week and was recorded by the X Factor singers, the original got back in the charts in the UK. Because people went, we need to go and buy that. 1981, 82. And the weird thing was it was never a hit here back then. So everybody's going, I remember this song. I was like, no, you don't. You know it because it's been used in films. Right. It was a kind of classic sort of John Hughes movie type song. But we didn't know it from it being a hit because it wasn't a hit back then. It might have been a radio hit, but it certainly wasn't a chart hit back then. So suddenly it was at number one in the charts 30 years after it had been released because of its use in a TV show. And that could happen, and that wouldn't have happened if they'd had to go out and press up singles to do it, because it would have taken too long for them to get them into the shops. So all of a sudden it's now 40 out of 15 million. So when we're talking incremental versus transformative change, 40 out of 130 or 40 out of 15 million, suddenly that 40 feels like it's the tip of a really irrelevant iceberg. Because even if the statistic is true that something like 60% of the records on iTunes have never been bought twice, which is one of the.
Well, you would expect a power distribution.
Absolutely, but it's actually the enormous number that people haven't even been able to convince their parents to both go out and buy a copy. That's how kind of neglected an enormous quantity of the music on iTunes is. But even that, even taking out 60% of that 20, we're looking at what's that? 8 million left. So it's still 40 out of 8 million that actually have some economic activity happening around them. And in any given week, there might be 100,000 albums that have economic activity going on in a given week. So suddenly, the idea that there are 40 places that people are fighting over is completely specious and ridiculous. And you can live your entire life devoted to music and consuming media around that music that never ever touches that popular level. And so we have the emergence of a zillion niches, right. and both the recording, we have communities that now serve those niches. So they make the music for them, but they also write about them, they do design around them, they produce social media content around that to feed those niches.
Even though they're at the 2 millionth place in the ranking, but it's still enough of an activity.
And all of a sudden, an awful lot of that can happen at home in spare time. So you have all of this latent possibility for success that isn't reliant on a record company investment.
Clay Shirky wrote this book called Here Comes Everybody, which is all about how this kind of...
Yeah, and I think that a lot of Clay's... I mean, I have a lot of time for Clay, I like him, but I think a lot of his excitement about this is actually is again latent, in the same way that the success is latent, is the manifestation of this wonderful brave new world that he's talking about. And a lot of that is to do with this encroaching of commercial interests on spaces that are private but feel public. So that Facebook is basically the new Canary Wharf. So in the way that Canary Wharf, if you go and visit, or it looks like open public space, there's no point at which you kind of cross a painted line on the road that says you're now on private land. But what you can do when you get there, even though it looks public, is severely curtailed. And Facebook is now that, and Twitter is that, and they feel like public space, and we feel a false sense of ownership of that space, but actually they game it massively in favour of the people who are going to give them money. So we're all working alongside that, because actually they're quite happy to have 100,000 music niches happening, because that's all demographic data that they can collect and sell to marketeers, in the way that local radio stations used to.
Right. Okay.
So it's not that it's a brand new manifestation. Local radio used to do that. Used to run car adverts on smooth jazz radio stations because they had done listener surveys that said that their listeners were more affluent than Radio 1 listeners, and this confluence of of subcultural metadata and grimly pernicious advertising, kind of thing. So, but that's not a new thing. It's just that it's been hyper sped up.
Yeah,
to the point where
it's grown enormously in size and variety, and the niches have increased in enormous number.
And we've utterly failed to critique it on a popular level. I mean, there are lots of brilliant academic critiques of it, but on a popular level, we haven't got to the point where most people, if you stopped on the bus, they said, what's wrong with the internet? And they wouldn't go, venture capital and advertising. They're not going to say that that's our two main problems.
Why would they?
Yeah, because both of those things actually serve are pushing buttons in a Pavlovian sense, but they actually provide them with what they want to a degree.
I mean, the sort of things that if anybody says what's wrong with the internet, they will start quoting, I don't know, bullying of young girls or something like that.
Yeah.
That's there. Without seeing that that's also a manifestation of a whole structure underneath.
That the inability to protect vulnerable people is because the internet is made by young, white, able-bodied, mostly straight Western men who have no idea what it is to be oppressed, threatened, subject to violence, political tyranny. They all live in what they think is a free state in America or Britain, and so they make structures for people like themselves, and so they don't get that, and so they do that in order to then be able to make a 100 billion quid at IPO stage, and we keep doing it. We keep piling in there. And I'd say this as someone who's built a career out of conversations on Facebook and Twitter. So I'm part of the problem, not the solution in that sense.
Well, it's not
but
clear what the solution is.
Well, no, absolutely. And I'm constantly my sort of my economy around this is going. Is my boycott going to be more valuable than my presence? And so this is why I didn't quit MySpace when Rupert Murdoch bought it, because as a conscientious objector to anything to do with Murdoch, it was the first time I had any involvement with anything of his at all. I would never have Sky TV. I won't even watch YouTube videos of things that are on Sky. It's pathological with me. I've never bought the Times. But I stayed on MySpace because I realised that my presence was more valuable to me than it was to him, and that at that point my boycott would cause a half a day's conversation and then I'd just be gone. So I'm a sort of social pragmatist in that sense, and the same.
Well, we all have to be at a certain level.
And I think I was also, because I was such a champion of Twitter and of its sort of fantastic disruptive power early on, before they started to kind of really cave into their needs to feed the gaping maw of VC expectation in terms of return. That Twitter was an absolutely transformative technology again, rather than an incremental one. They were the first people to do social media right, and it was destroyed by that need for 18% return a year on their investment, or whatever it is that the VCs are expecting. Where was I going with all this? So this change from a place where there was a level of sort of national consensus around what music entertainment should be, and the top 40 was significant, and Top of the Pops is the ultimate manifestation of that you would get 3-4 generations of a family sat around watching Top of the Pops on a Thursday night to see what the songs were, and you said this completely bizarre scenario where you would have a family sat around and they might be watching Captain Sensible doing Happy Talk, or they might be watching Slayer, and who were an American thrash metal band, and these things would all happen in front of a whole family. So you had this sense that there was a shared. It was compartmentalised, but it was a shared experience.
That I think is a very interesting point, because we've tended with modern technology and the way society is structured to all the time compartmentalise more and more and not meet. So the fact that you're pointing to Top of the Pops as a kind of way that's different, a very broad range of society was exposed to a wide range of music, is interesting, because we've lost that. I mean, I think of things like in Greece, the socially levelling effect of military service. Not that I'm in any way in favour of military, but the obligation to go there means that you meet people of a different world to your background, and you get a broader sense of what's going on in the world. Nowadays, because we get, with the recommender systems and all these things that we have on the internet, we're all living in smaller and smaller niches. When you look at Twitter and see who does it recommend you should follow, they're all the kind of people that you anyway follow anyway. They're
And-
not people that you've never thought of following in your life.
And we can also search people's preferences, and we were presented with those, and we're encouraged to brand ourselves with those, Facebook more so than Twitter, so that we prejudge people. And so rather than meeting someone at work and then further down the line discovering that they vote UKIP and going, oh God, what's going on? And having to sort of wrestle with the fact that there's somebody you like who votes UKIP, that we prejudge that and go, I'm not going to friend them. Why? Because they liked UKIP on Facebook. And so we end up with we don't wrestle with those fuzzy edges around which we then have to realise that all of us are deeply inconsistent in our thinking, and that's part of the beauty of being human, is that genuinely consistent. I remember my mum telling me this years ago. She said, people who are genuinely unconflicted people are terrifying to be around, and really awkward, utterly consistent people.
Yeah.
Because they end up refusing to do normal things because it becomes a sort of.
You end up being a bureaucrat following a set of rules.
Or it becomes Jainism, where you're kind of sweeping the street in order to avoid stepping on bugs, and which is kind of okay if you see that as a monastic vocation, and so I think that there is an element to it to that sort of ascetic model of denying yourself things that you think are actually negative.
Yes, but that's very problematic when it's somebody who's in the world, who's actually interacting with people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
projecting
go up to your cave and
projecting that onto them, and for sure. And I think, carrying on the spiritual analogy, I think that the equivalent of I've said this to you before, that the equivalent of that cross-cultural experience in Greece that was the
there were
military service
ones in Britain.
But I think the main one here that has disappeared was the church.
Yes.
And that used to be the multi-generational meeting point, and that because the art in the church was conformed to a 400, 500-year-old standard, that wasn't a stumbling block. And when in the 80s that became a thing, and you started having youth churches with rock bands in them, and and churches that branded themselves by the strength of their presentation, rather than the quality of their stained glass, that all of a sudden that even for people who carried on going to church, I mean, an enormous falling away of people going to church, but even for people who carried on doing that, they started to cluster into social groups and generational groups, and so that bastion, even if we wanted to preserve it, that even within the bastion doesn't exist anymore. And so we have this sort of progressive striation, and I think so. The key thing about all of this is that all of these observations about changing culture, some of which were afforded an acceleration by the internet, but most of which have been underway for a very long time. That they're sort of post-industrial changes rather than that digitization has accelerated a lot of them.
You get this contrary flow then. You've got on the one hand industrialization bringing more and more people from the countryside with all their separate villages and dialects, let's say, or accents at least in Britain, bring them to the city. You get a kind of melting pot phenomenon. But on the other hand, also over the past 100 years, you get more and more dividing up of people into separate categories who communicate less and less to each other.
And
there's always this two streams pushing in opposite directions.
And as with everything, the cliches follow the money, and kind of you say, well, why were those things pushed? And they were pushed because of governments liked cities because they're efficient means of kind of control, and that they were a useful production model when everybody had to go into the centre to work and then come out again. And so suburbs were developed because they weren't on an individual level, they weren't productive at all, because you spent 2 hours a day travelling. But on a macro level, it was brilliant. You could have everybody travelling at the same time and build your infrastructure around that, and everybody would go to work and go home, and then you could target them with whatever was happening in the evening. And so evening TV became a big thing. What we had in Britain was, the odd thing about that was that we had this consensus about certain things being public goods and therefore not commercialised. And the encroaching commercialisation, we didn't actually rethink any of those processes around it. So what we had was we had infrastructure that was based around public health, public broadcasting, public schooling, all of this kinds of public schooling in the kind of not in public school setting, state schooling, yes. We had all of those things, and so those structures were there to support that, to support the idea that those were common goods. And then when we sold off all that infrastructure, we suddenly put a value on it and realised that it was worth an awful lot more than the government sold it for. So we have this huge imbalance between those who now own that and own something that is worth a lot more than they paid for it. And the rest of us are having to pay for it based on the valuation rather than on the cost. So this huge wrench in society between us having collectively owned this incredible, basically priceless infrastructure, because it's not replaceable. That the problem that the Labour government now have is that actually returning the NHS to what it was is going to involve a fair amount of tyrannical behaviour by government. They're going to have to actually start taking things back. They can't afford to buy it back. The country can't afford to do that. If we maintain our current system of money, so unless we completely reinvent what we do with money, that under sort of commonly held capitalist understanding of money, there isn't enough money to buy all that infrastructure.
That's a separate conversation.
But it's one that we need to understand changes in economic activity around artistic ephemera within that context, because our whole relationship between cost of living and disposable cash, and how we perceive freely available stuff that we're paying for by looking at adverts and then buying other things elsewhere versus buying a thing from a person, that all of those social changes are manifest in what we do with art, and yet musicians are clumsily going, people don't value art anymore, people don't value music, and you know, no one buys music anymore. You go, well, everybody's buying music, they're just buying it by watching adverts. That it's being paid for at an absurdly low unit cost, but somebody somewhere is making an absolute killing of it. And
well, you trained a whole bunch of people, and you provided a technology which makes, as you said, the incremental reproduction cost almost nothing. On the other hand, there is this view which I'd like you kind of to respond to, that the ability to sell records is a unique phenomenon that was a temporary phenomenon in the music industry. It doesn't apply to works of art, paintings. It doesn't apply to other arts in the same way. And in effect, what we're reverting to is a world where, as in the 19th century or 18th century, artists have to go and meet their audience, perform in front of them, and that's the fundamental relationship.
Well, I think relationship is the key here. I think the idea that the relationship has to be mediated by performance is that's a very 19th century view.
Okay, now that's what I want to get you to talk about.
So this is the thing, and this is the point. The thing that disrupts it all is again, the pull quote question is that I would ask is why, if everything of mine is available for free, do people choose to pay for it? Right. How do I make a few grand a year from sales of things that everybody can have for free? And
which I do.
And then, so this isn't a hypothetical. This is this is asking why did this happen? And my observation is that people pay for things they're grateful for, and that what they're grateful for is they're not they're grateful for the existence of the art, but they're grateful to me as the creator for doing that. Right. So paying a shop, paying a third party, paying Spotify for access to it, all that, none of that is meaningful at all. There's no reason why those people should do that instead of torrenting it, because there's no expression to me in doing that. Whereas they will come to my website and pay up to, the most of someone once paid £100 for downloading one album. They weren't paying for one album. They weren't going, these 11 songs are worth £9 each.
You as supporting your work.
Yeah, so what they were doing was saying, thank you so much for doing what you do, for existing in the way you do. They were probably paying me out of gratitude for my blog, for my writing work, for me making them laugh occasionally on Facebook or Twitter. And there was this was them saying, I have more money than you, I can see that you're broke, I'm willing to be a part of the sustainability of your art practice.
But this perhaps points to another fundamental change, because that relationship between the person who gave you the £100 and you is a classic one of patronage, going back possibly thousands of years. But patronage was usually a one-to-one relationship. There was a rich king or somebody, and he funded a musician or a painter or somebody to work for him. Now we have the possibility with technology for patronage in effect to be spread, that multiplicity of people can be your patrons at a certain level.
I think the difference with patronage is,
they can all appreciate their gratitude.
But even in terms of that relationship is what's in it for the patron, and I think that the patronage used to be actually incredibly self-serving. But it was
Yes.
look at what I have. So there was actually a sense of ownership
Yeah.
of the work, and so now that flaunting of your patronage is now a choice. And some people choose to do that, and I love it when they do. I love it when people go, look what I just gave this person. I really enjoy that. I kind of like that. I like the feeling that people are proud to support what I do. But an awful lot of them don't tell anyone. So an awful lot of them, it's just their transaction with me. So it doesn't conform to that Mozartian understanding of patronage because it's not like American
It's not part of
philanthropy.
showing off.
It's not CSR money. It's not a private version of CSR, PSR, private social
CSR.
responsibility. Yeah, it's like if we invented a new thing. It's not. It doesn't manifest itself in that way. They're not saying I'll give you this if you put my name on the website. And there are Kickstarter models that are very much that.
Right.
You know, if you pay me £100, I'll put your name on the CD cover. That's absolutely classic patronage.
Right.
That's totally that's not in material terms worth anything. It's I will do this because I'm a patron of the arts and I want it to be manifest that I am that. You'll mention me in the back. I'll get a thank you in the back of the book, and therefore.
Well, there was always that option in those days where you could be anonymous. You could not, or not. You could say, I don't want my name, and people would acknowledge an anonymous gift from somebody.
Absolutely, and I think that has always happened. I think that was distinct from patronage, where the value proposition was what can I say about myself by claiming to have done this? What can I?
That fits in with a very basic human need to show off, to have identity, to.
And the Americans get this better than we do. We're very uncomfortable with that, and an American tax system is built around that. It's built around the idea that they're like, please show off by giving money away, and in order to encourage you to do it, we're going to make it all tax deductible. So whenever you give money away to a charitable foundation or whatever, we're going to give you money back for doing that because we want to encourage you to do that, and so they get competitive about it. It's a weirdly macho thing. So, hey, I just gave $100,000 to such and such. So they have these dinners where people will go and pay $20,000 to sit in a room with a politician as a fundraiser, and that's kind of anathema to us. That over here we would expect to get an audience with the person for that, not just to sit in the room with them. We manage that in a very different way, and I think that there's a huge amount of sort of progressive nuance in people's motivation for those kind of behaviours. I don't think that I can sit down and say the reason that everybody pays me is for this. The one continuously present element, to a greater or lesser degree, is gratitude. And so I think for me, I was talking to a bunch of students at Access to Music about this morning. Not my students, another business bunch, and I was saying that the key thing for me is narrative context. That art doesn't exist in a vacuum, that people don't buy my music because they've listened to it and this is objectively better than other music, therefore I must have it. That's not what's going on at all. What they're doing is they're finding me interesting because of the narrative context, and then going, what is the art that is the product of this story? Is this music
Okay.
the denouement
So
of the story?
It's not just the particular track that you and then people look at you. It's rather they look at you and then they end up with the music.
Yeah, and which is why the beautiful thing that's happened to my audience demographic since Twitter is that it's no longer a bunch of bass players. It's no longer just a bunch of dudes that come along to watch my fingers moving. It's become this incredibly broad and interesting and fascinating range of people from different cultures and backgrounds, and people whose other musical interests range from. There are people who only listen to stadium rock, and then somewhere in their collection is me, and everything else is Coldplay and Travis and God knows what else. And there are other people for whom their interest lies in extreme metal or classical music, and they can all hear something in what I do that resonates with them because they didn't come in through the music.
So has that affected your music? Has it changed the audience and the way you relate to the audience?
It stopped it from it prevented a negative change that I felt happening. Right. So in 2006 I stopped playing to sort of bass players intentionally for 6 or 7 years. I just went, I'm sick of playing to people who are listening to me with their eyes, and so that happened to coincide with my discovery of the joy of house concerts. I mean, my second ever solo gig was a house concert, so it's not that I hadn't done them before, but moving to that as my dominant model happened in 2008. So 2006 I stopped playing to bass players. 2007 I did a couple of tours with my now wife, who was at the time a singer I was touring with, and which were economically really perilous. But we were trying to play clubs and that kind of stuff, and that was tricky. 2008 we discovered house concerts, and off the back of a single tweet, this is again the sort of change in power balance on Twitter, because between us we had about 2,000 followers at that time on Twitter, and from a single tweet of me saying we're going to do a house concert tour, who wants to book us? We got 30 replies, and 24 of which turned into gigs.
Wow.
So as an efficient booking process, that was the greatest it's ever been. And a lot of those relationships are ones that had been formed via a video chat platform called Seismic, which was sort of Facebook but with video. You would just, instead of posting a reply, you would post a video reply. So it was all public. It wasn't seedy. It wasn't some kind of Match.com kind of weirdness. It was just a chat site, and that, again, having a physical presence, that became the narrative context. And that was an incredibly powerful one, because so many of my most valued friends in the social media space are people I met through that. And those are places we still go and play. So the context isn't that they turn around and go, the two greatest musicians I've ever heard are Steve and Lobelia. It's that these are great friends of mine and I want to support what they do.
Right.
So
I mean, you talk about this gratitude, you talk about this relationship, you talk about meaning in a certain sense.
Absolutely.
It's all of this has to do with having. There is a depth of meaning in the relationship that seems to make it all work, which is, I mean, in a certain sense, information technology as a whole is very good at removing meaning. It's very good at narrowing the band of communication. It's very efficient in what it does, but it's very limited in that act of communication. So it's interesting that you're overcoming the limitations of the technology, the limitations in the sense of destroying the old economic models by reinserting a level of meaning that was absent.
Yeah, and I think it's the key principle is disintermediation. It's the idea that I've removed that layer in the middle, which was both a commercial layer but also a controlling layer. It was a series of gatekeepers who were normally between me and my audience. And so it used to be. So if I'd been doing what I'm doing now, 20 years ago, I would have my main concern would have been getting to magazines. Right. There was limited radio support for the kind of thing that I do, and so what I would have been aiming for is magazines aimed at musicians, which would have had an influence on the art, because obviously I'd have had to play things that were more flashy and showy than I currently do. But magazines would have been the place where I could have explained that. I wouldn't have had a way to talk to an audience about that. If I'd had a paper newsletter, that becomes a very expensive way of
But now you can talk to your audience about what you're doing.
And I can talk to them individually, but I can talk to them individually in a way that's visible. So rather than it being an email to you, if you and I are talking on Twitter, I can make that visible to anybody. That anybody who follows both of us will see that, and anybody who doesn't, if you come to make a comment about what I do that's interesting, I can reshare that. And so whereas if I did that with letters, if I was photocopying letters and sticking them up in my window, going, look at this, what someone just said about me, that's weird. On Twitter, it's kind of okay. So it's more conversational. It's more conversation in the pub, where you're the loudest person talking, so other people are overhearing it. But
that's the way Dougal describes using Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Imagine that you're in the pub and you're overhearing a number of conversations.
Absolutely, and that's a useful one in terms of the mechanics of jumping into a conversation. How do you wheedle your way into an interesting conversation in the pub? Well, you're polite about it. You don't jump in and go, "You're all wrong," which is common thing.
All right, let's go back to Benjamin. We were heading in that direction, and now the world has changed. The quality of the recording is wonderful. So does that invalidate Benjamin's critique?
Well, I think that so there are two things I find interesting about him. One of which is that he was talking about fairly shabby reproductions of art, and so that despite him being an enormous snob, there were two things I find interesting about him. One of which is he was talking about bad facsimile of art, and that was so his complaint was qualitative as well as philosophical. But the other was that he was a music critic. He was a writer about music, and the reproduction of work robbed him of his preeminence as an opinion on this stuff, because people could experience it, and they weren't. So most of his readers had never experienced the thing that he was writing about. So he was utterly in control of that beforehand. He was completely in control of a conversation around music. That basically people's experience of a concert, that concert would never be repeated. So him writing about that, going, I went to see the London Phil do Stravinsky, and I am the person who is going to mediate your understanding of that importance. With a recording, they could put it on and go, this guy's full of it. This is nonsense. This is a great recording. so there was a huge challenge to his position as the arbiter of quality within culture, as well as a very well argued point about poor facsimiles, you're not getting the experience.
I mean, it's a very old view, this thing about the original and the copy and the lessonness of the copy. I mean, if you think about well, in the Roman world, there was this passion to copy Greek sculptures, right? So you have these enormous collections all over Europe where there are Roman remains. There are, so and so. Oh, it's a copy of a sculpture by some famous Greek sculptor. And I don't know what the view was, whether these sculptures were lesser because they were copies. But I mean, in the last few centuries, the copy is always denigrated.
Yeah, although I think one of my problems with Benjamin in that setting is because he talks about this as sort of a novel manifestation, this idea of reproduction. That one of the things he misses is mundane use of art. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't talk about currency as a perfectly acceptable replication of art. That he didn't say, oh, this is terrible. If there was only one £10 note, it would be brilliant. But there are hundreds of them, and in that, art played a completely different role, because art was about it being sufficiently complex to be non-replicable. The art on banknotes is there for its complexity and its uniqueness, and so art played a completely different purpose. And it's only in replication that it has any meaning at all. Yeah. The idea of a single instance of a banknote is ridiculous.
It's a very interesting example. Yeah.
So he didn't talk about that. So he had
but I mean, the kind of world that Benjamin came from, that was only concerned with high art.
Exactly. Well, this is where his snobbery.
Classical music, great paintings, sculpture, full stop.
So there was some snobbery there, but I also think that he hadn't really thought about, because he talks in his understanding of emergent art forms. Obviously, film was the dominant one at the time. The film was an entirely new concept, and
not art.
No, but he did sort of at arm's length with gloves on. He engaged with it as a kind of a new manifestation of he talked sort of about the ontology of distributed film in a kind of in an interesting way, and about it being able to create just with its scale a different kind of meaning than you can get with any other sort of for the physical presence of a play. But he clearly wasn't a fan. I mean, he didn't talk about. He talks about it as a sort of realist form. He doesn't really get into what Georges Méliès was doing, which was the sort of completely bizarre fantasy, Dada-y sort of craziness, and the meaning of that. Because actually that was the forerunner to what music became when the re-enchantment of recorded music became about making recording a completely separate thing from performance. When you started to make recordings that were unreproducible as performances, which is musique concrète was really the first place that it happened. So it happened within his domain, within art music, a high art concept. Well, I'm sure he wasn't much of a Stockhausen fan. But within musique concrète, you suddenly had this recorded music that existed for its recording. It wasn't a document of a performance. So he's talking about bad documentation.
So does that mean, now that we have good documentation, we have good reproduction?
But we also have as a recording as a standalone art form. So we have so this is the thing that he didn't get. He didn't understand that a recording should be a standalone. He saw it as a bad facsimile of a performance, and it does, and it still doesn't stand up. That watching a DVD of a gig, it's either about remembering the presence or about imagining the presence.
Okay, but so I was about to ask you that. So what's the difference? I mean, is there?
Well, so there
we're not denying that there is a qualitative difference between being at the gig and watching the DVD.
So if we take a classic live performance like Pink Floyd live at Pompeii, which is itself it was an enormous event, and it, again all caveats about it being a bunch of English public school boys aside, but that's the affordance there was that they all had the money to do this, and they could afford to lose it if they needed to. This wasn't, these weren't the musical equivalent of coal miners going out to work. This was a posh thing to do. But that serves a number of purposes. If you were there, it's a reminder. If you weren't, you can imagine having been there and gone, wouldn't it have been amazing to actually sit in that acoustic space and hear that? You look at it, you watch it, you imagine the acoustic space. We're fairly good at that kind of thing. There's the way that the document is manifest on screen that could never be manifest in person because you've got cutting from close-ups of each individual musician.
So in that sense, at that point, we're talking about a different creative object.
Yeah, that aesthetically and materially, it's become its own art form. But you've also then, so as well as having angle being a separate thing, that you suddenly have presence next to each musician and their view of what's going on because of these cameras over their shoulders. You also have the edit. So what you have is five people who were very stoned playing for 3 hours, condensed down to 45 minutes. I don't know if that's in that particular example that's what happened, but a lot of that stuff that what you had the option to do was to edit, and to then present the best of it, so that the legacy of a particular performance was its idealised form. It wasn't the 2 hours of bloated nonsense. It was 45 minutes of really tightly honed thing that again cultural context is key to this, that people's understanding of what was important and even people's attention span is a culturally mediated concept. So there are cultures within which a 2 hour performance is considered quite short, and some within which it's inconceivable that someone would do that. And so the edit to 45 minutes was dictated by the length of vinyl. That trying to squeeze as much time out of a record as possible became a preoccupation in the 80s. And releasing a double album was itself a statement, a grandiose statement. And so
but it used to be 22 minutes or something.
22 minutes aside, yeah, that's right, yeah. And so I think Def Leppard's Hysteria managed to stretch that to something like 25. So they got 50 minutes out of a vinyl record, but it was they were pushing it.
So we end up in a world where reproduction is much more effective, much higher quality. The electronic format, whether it's film or record or DVD, this kind of documentary that we're talking about, becomes an art object in itself.
Yep.
And yet people still go to the gigs, go to the concerts, go to the real events, go to the theatre. They even go to listen to the novelist reading from his book.
And this is where we're back to the second of... So Benjamin's first contention is that reproduction destroys the aura around a work. And so the re-enchantment of work was often about, again, back to narrative context, it was about making recording into a sacred process and telling that story, to the point where, the Beatles named an album Abbey Road. At what greater elevation can you get for a studio than to actually call your album, name your album after the studio where you recorded it? So we had that, but his second main contention within the work of art in the age of reproduction is that reproduction breaks the relationship between art and ritual. And so what we have with people, so we have to have two things going on here. One of which is that people still reject the mundanity of listening to a recording at home over the experience of re-ritualizing music by going to a gig.
They prefer the gig.
Yeah, absolutely. So long as the sense of payoff is there, I think that a lot of venues have struggled with this because they've become functional and utilitarian rather than experiential. And so the idea of going and standing in a dark room with a bad PA and beer on the floor to hear a band, people are like, well, no, I need something better than that. So the Symphony Hall in Birmingham does really well. It's full pretty much every concert because it's an experience and it's a ritual, and you get dressed up and you buy your tickets and you go and buy your drink at the bar and you wait.
We're talking about meaning. Really.
Absolutely, exactly, and so it reinvests that meaning.
Ritual is just a different way of talking about meaning.
Exactly, yeah, absolutely. So it becomes that you re-engage with it as a sacrament. That there's a transactional thing that goes on between you and the artists are.
So both in your conversation on Twitter with people who appreciate you and in the real life gig or concert, the key point is the reintroduction of meaning, the ritual, the experiential value that there is in that.
it's about reintroduction of both meaning and magic, because it needs to not be mundane, and if there's ever an accusation that can be levelled at me of sort of the failure of what I do is that I do often rob my own process of its magic, that I don't and it's a I don't know, it's a sort of Marxist tendency, I guess, to turn it into work when it can be magic for people, and I kind of sort of constantly trying to juggle that and be able to allow the magic to exist in the music without having to pretend that I'm special. That's the long-term goal. Is can the music be of massive importance to people without me having to be Freddie Mercury behind it?
But that's a personal thing.
No, absolutely, yeah. So I think
music can be immensely important without it saying anything about you as
but that's tricky for the person who's acting as mediator between the art and the audience. That I, as the artist, am now the mediator. So that's one of the things that I'm constantly juggling. But so allowing it to be magical for people is a key thing. But I think one of the most important things about this, and it's one of the things that a lot of people miss, is that when you are the husband of the language, I don't mean married to, I mean as in husbandry, as in like you are the shepherd of the language around which that exists around your work. That's an incredibly important role. So, for example, I never use the word free in relation to my music. Partly because I think that in economic terms it's a very clumsily misunderstood idea, and I don't think Kevin Kelly helped with this book at all. But also, I think that for me it negates the value of the time and the attention that people have put into it. That as soon as someone listens to what I've done, it ceases to be free, because they've chosen to invest time in it when they could. There are a billion other things they could do,
yeah.
And instead they've gone, I'm going to listen to that, and I need to acknowledge that as having value. I can't pretend that the only thing that matters is money in that setting.
I think we should try and wrap the conversation up.
Yes, it's been very long. It's marvellous.
But it's fascinating, because I think we could go on all night, because the next thing I'd like to talk about is the whole thing of attention, which we've just begun to talk about, and the value of attention and how important attention is. But it's been a wonderful conversation.
It's been lovely. It's great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.